Okay, great. Welcome back, everybody, for session 2. Today is going to be design and best practices and IRB issues. So this is a non-technical talk. We will be doing more JS Psych next week. This week is going to be a bit more abstract from the mechanics of actually putting together your experiment and more about what experiment should you put together. And so I'll be doing the presenting, but I want to acknowledge the team. There was a lot of people put a lot of work into the workshop as a whole, including this week. So a little bit of background on online experiments. So Amazon Mechanical Turk was released, I think, around 2008 or so. The first online psych study that I know of was actually published in 1986. And I'm sorry, I should have the citation here. And for perspective, that's actually even before the World Wide Web was established. So it actually was done by email. They didn't have the word email yet. I think they called it electronic messaging system. And in fact, there's been, basically as long as the web has been around, quite a lot of research online by psychologists specifically. But again, before Amazon Mechanical Turk existed, over a quarter of APA journals had published online studies. Most of this was done on basically websites that online laboratories that researchers created specifically for the purpose of running online experiments. So here's a bunch of the more prominent ones when they were established. And this has led to a lot of very large studies. So again, most people are more familiar with Amazon Mechanical Turk studies, which look a lot like studies that are run in the laboratory, but just run on Amazon Mechanical Turk. But there's been an increasing number, going back really to the beginning of the century, of these large studies with hundreds of thousands of subjects as well. And a much larger number of non-AMT, non-prolific online studies that don't have a large number of subjects. So this talk is really going to be about online experiments in general. And where necessary, I'm going to try to distinguish between different kinds of online experiments. So one type is labor market studies. These are the ones that are most familiar. So you hire somebody on an online labor market to do your study. So that might be from Amazon Mechanical Turk, or I'm lumping prolific in here as well. It's not technically an online labor market. It's an online study pool, but that operates very similarly. Then there are various open experiments that anybody on the web can participate in. So obviously, subjects have to actually be registered with AMT or prolific to participate in those experiments. Some of these are going to be compensated, usually with a raffle, right? So participating enters you in a raffle for a gift certificate. You've probably even participated in these studies. But then there's a lot of pure volunteer studies. There's no compensation. There's no external compensation. There may be internal compensation in the sense that doing the experiment is rewarding in its own right. And so this is what most of those experiments on the online laboratories I was talking about. That's how they work. I'm not going to talk much about citizen science projects. So often the pure volunteer studies get lumped in with citizen science. There's a useful distinction to be made here, though, in that citizen science is what you would see if you go to Zooniverse, where actually the online participants aren't subjects, they're actually deputy researchers and more directly involved in the science. But there's been some such projects in psychology and language science, but not as many, and I won't talk that much about them. I can talk about them in Q&A. And then there's various studies that involve found data. So these are large data sets that already exist for their own reason, like Twitter or Facebook. And again, I'm not going to talk a lot about those either. So the kinds of questions that I see usually coming up when people are interested in maybe starting to do online studies involve things like, well, what can I measure, right? So everybody knows you can do surveys. Can you do anything besides a survey online? Also, what's the data quality like? Is this just a bunch of junk? Am I getting, you're worried about basically who knows who's on the internet. And then also less common, but also significant are privacy, security, IRB questions. And I'm going to preview the answers to these, which is range of measures is actually quite wide. And when you think about it, you already know this is true. Think about all the things you can currently do on the internet or with network devices, including wearables. I've got a Fitbit here. Strictly speaking, somebody could do a study using my Fitbit data if I donated it. And actually, and this includes a lot of real world sort of like acting out in the wild measures as well. So you can measure body position and things like that through, say, like a Kinect, which is also wired. Quality is actually quite good. This has been really at this point almost studied to death. And there's really no evidence that online studies are more problematic than in lab studies. So we're going to talk about best practices in a lot of detail. And privacy and security and IRB issues are unfamiliar, but in some ways actually easier than dealing with them in the laboratory. But I'm going to get to these issues later later today. In the second half of the talk, we'll have a pause probably about an hour through so people can get water and stuff. But I think the most significant question, and the one I'm actually going to spend probably the most time on, is these questions are really all about how do you run your experiment online, some experiment that you've already thought up. But I think like the right question really to be asking is, how do I do my research online? I'm gonna explain to you why I think that's different. But first, an outline of what we're going to be doing today. We'll initially be talking about basically online studies are not the same thing as lab studies in ways that may not immediately be obvious, of a bunch of motivating examples, and then talk about what kinds of measures you can get, what kind of data quality, how to get good data quality, how to recruit subjects, and privacy and security, and IRB. So again, this workshop, I know there's a lot of people participating who are not language scientists, but it is centered on language science. The canonical psycholinguistic experiments are things like grammaticality judgment or lexical decision. You see strings and decide, is this a word or not? Novel word learning or extension, self-paced reading with maybe some comprehension questions, coordination games where you have some task involving novel objects with a partner, and you have to come up with ways of referring to those objects, or you don't really know that's what your job is, but that's really what the study's about. There's some features of all these sort of standard paradigms that are common. One is they take place in a testing room, right? So you bring people into some sort of environment to do them. They take about 30 to 60 minutes usually. They're one and done. So there are experiments that involve multiple sessions, but those are very much the exception. There's usually subjects are numbered in the dozens, not hundreds. And there's a bunch of distinct trials, right? So, well, you know what trials are. And they're generally not intrinsically rewarding, right? We have to basically get people who don't really want to do this study to do it by saying they have to do it in order to get class credit or by giving them some money. What's interesting is all of this is very similar to a college exam or class exercise. And you might ask, why do language experiments look like college exams? Well, one possibility, of course, is that somebody just thought this was a good idea and we've been doing it that way since. But that wouldn't be a very good reason to continue doing it. Another possibility is that through decades of experimentation and practice, we've learned that this is actually the optimal way to do experiments, to research. I hope that's not the case because we have a lot of evidence that this is not a particularly good way of collecting data, right? So there's really well-known problems. Our samples are inevitably weird, so Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, so just like not a typical sample of the world's population. Studies are inevitably very low power. So if you look at the actual kinds of questions that people are asking, if your question is there an effect of some manipulation? Then you have to say, well, how small of an effect would you count as being an effect? If you take that to be a Cohen's d of 0.05, which is 1/20th of a standard deviation, and you have a 2-sample t-test, to get decent power, you need about 5,000 subjects per condition, which obviously is very hard to do in the laboratory. But that's a very typical sort of question somebody might have. There's also uncertain generalization to minor variations. So often it turns out that minor changes in stimuli or procedure change the results of the study, which is not great, right, if you want to make some generalizations from your study. Also, The process is pretty slow, right? So data collection takes a while. So it doesn't seem like it's, and there's other issues as well. It doesn't seem like this is super optimal. Another possibility, which is the one I think is right, is that decades of experimentation and practice show us that this is the optimal method for on-campus experiments. Right? If you're going to do an experiment on campus, these features are reasonable features. So they involve subjects and resources that are readily available on campus, in quantities available on campus. There's pretty limited subject willingness to participate frequently or for long periods. This is why the studies are short and they're one and done. The paradigm test taking is really familiar to both researchers, who are professional exam writers, and subjects who are elite exam takers, right? So literally our subjects are some of the best exam takers in the world. That's actually how they got selected in to being subjects. And also another advantage is you can use specialized equipment in the laboratory. And this used to be crucial, right? So in the early days of psychology, to measure reaction time or to have precise stimulus presentation, you needed all this jury-rigged equipment. But these days, most behavioral experiments are done using equipment that our subjects already have at home. Over half of the world's population has internet access. So they don't even need to come into the laboratory to give us their data. They can do that at home too. And so the key point I really want to make here, and I'm going to really be focusing on this for a while because I think it is worth thinking about and important, is that Labbit paradigms don't always work online because they aren't meant to. Right, so I often hear concerns from people that their experiments can't be run online because they're too boring, they take too long, they require this or that, and that may be true, but you may also not want to be running the experiments the way you always have that was optimized for one environment when you're actually in a different environment. So some ways in which the online environment's very different. Subjects can and will quit your study, right? So we always tell subjects we have to, for IRB reasons, that they're allowed to quit an experiment anytime in the laboratory, but they don't. I mean, they have the sunk costs, they've come into the laboratory, there's this social pressure to not leave. But if online subjects don't want to do your study, they will just quit. It is much easier for them to come back and do multi-session experiments because there's no travel involved. They may not even need to schedule a particular time. They can just do it whenever. Another important thing is subjects are not necessarily professional test takers. And this means that they're not necessarily going to have the same intuitions about the study as you do. So one of my favorite examples is from a friend of mine who was piloting a digit symbol coding study with an old friend who had not gone to college, wasn't necessarily a professional test taker. And so this digit span, right? So you read somebody a list of numbers and they have to read them back. So the experimenter read the list of numbers, the friend wrote down the numbers and then read them back. When the experimenter said, no, you can't do that, the subject said, why not? You told me to read these things, to repeat these things back to you. It's much easier if I write them down. Why are you changing the rules on me? And when you think about it, an awful lot of what's involved in exam construction, where you have somebody who knows the answer to a question, asking somebody for the answer, and often involves very strange rules about what you are and aren't allowed to do, is a really unnatural thing. And there are plenty of people who are just not going to be familiar with it. And that is something that you have to take into consideration in designing your studies. By the way, this is a point that's not particularly shocking to people who do, say, acquisition research. So if you work with little kids, that's obvious. You can't just give them exams. They don't know what to do. But for folks who work with adults, often you don't necessarily even think about just how much cultural knowledge is built into our exam style experiments. Also, the feasible numbers are different, right? So if you can only test dozens in the laboratory, you can, as I showed you before, potentially test millions online. And this has a number of important effects. One is that we often enforce a lot of homogeneity in our research subjects, right? So you may want, if you're doing a neuroimaging study, only right-handers. You may want only monolingual English speakers, things like that. And part of the reason is that if you have 20 subjects and one of them is not a monolingual English speaker, it's not entirely clear what, if their results are funny, is this, funny, like outliers, is this because they're not a monolingual English speaker? Is it actually they're just not outliers? This, you didn't understand the distribution of the population. But when you have much larger numbers of subjects and you have many monolingual and bilingual subjects, now you can actually just start analyzing the effects of these subject differences, which results in a much more interesting study often. Also, the number of stimuli, the number of conditions, the kind of randomization you do is all you're going to be able to do something very different, right? So counterbalancing, for instance, is important if you have 20 subjects and 5 conditions. If you have 1,000 subjects and 5 conditions, counterbalancing actually just like numerically stops being that important. And actually, some of the disadvantages of counterbalancing start showing up, where counterbalancing usually involves a limited number of possible samples from the space of random orders or whatnot. It'd be better just outright randomize. And then the available paradigms are different, right? So again, if in-lab experiments are really designed around a paradigm very familiar to the subjects and experimenters, there are other paradigms that are very familiar online. So viral quizzes, games, obviously educational apps, social media, basically all the various things that people typically do online. And we'll sort of get back to how how some folks have used these paradigms to do, I think, really interesting studies. All right, so now I want to get into probably what's going to take a lot of the time up until our break, a bunch of motivating examples. Because again, I think that probably a lot of you came to this talk thinking that we're going to be expecting us to mostly talk about best practices for data quality. And again, we will talk about them. As I said, I think they actually turn out to be anticlimactic. They basically are, do good, well-designed research. But I think that where I have seen, over the years, people get stuck in running online experiments is really stuck on trying to do experiments online exactly the way they would do them in the laboratory. And that both resulting in sometimes worse outcomes than if they had done it in the laboratory, but also really lost the opportunity to do something potentially much more interesting than and much more impactful for their research questions than what they would have been, what they had been thinking of. Because again, we have now 150 years of institutional knowledge about what paradigms work in the laboratory. We have a lot of cultural intuitions about what's the right number of subjects, what's the right number of items. I want to study, I don't know, in processing of morphology. I know there's a few different kinds of paradigms. I can use generalization experiments, lexical decision. There's a few standard paradigms that you're familiar with. And we just don't have that rich cultural knowledge for online studies. And that's why I think that probably the most important thing that I can communicate here is, basically like, what are the options? What can you actually do? One thing that will be familiar to a lot of language researchers is there's been really nice use on Amazon Mechanical Turk in particular, or use of Amazon Mechanical Turk to study cultural evolution. So here's one of the prominent, relatively early studies. And the idea in these studies is you're going to, if it's a language evolution study, you're going to teach people teach a person a novel language, test them, use their responses on the tests as the input for the next learner, and so on. So it's like a game of telephone. And you can look at how, hopefully study how people's learning biases end up affecting, transmission of information over time as a way of figuring out what their biases are. So here in this study, over 10 generations, on the left there, you see that Learning got better. People made fewer errors on on what they were supposed to learn. So basically, the languages were being changed in ways that made them easier to learn. And these are, I believe, like 4 different transmission chains. So like 4 different initial people being trained whose data went on to 4 more people who went on to 4 more people and so forth. And then on the right, the languages became more structured for some metric. I'm not going to talk a lot. This is probably the study in which I talk the most about what the actual results are. I'm really going to be focused, this is again not a science talk, it's a methods talk. I'm going to be really focused on what methods did people use. So there's been a lot of cool cultural evolution studies, and you can see why they are possible to do in the laboratory, but quite hard. They're much easier to do online. Group dynamics, there's been a lot of interesting work with group dynamics, because in many ways it is easier to put together and manipulate groups of interacting individuals online. So here are slides from Mark Whitting. I think this is a really neat study. Why did it have to end this way? Understanding the consistency of team fracture. So the idea is if we could rewind time, would troubled teams have the same outcomes? And if a team didn't work together, is that, just like those people just couldn't get along, or is it, some random, perturbation resulted in that? So their experimental method is they're going to reconvene the same teams repeatedly without the people in the teams realizing it, and then measure behavioral consistency across the team interactions. So the idea is you have some group interacting, and then you make a new group. So you have you just mix up people across groups. Now we have a new group, 4 people who were originally in 4 different groups. But then we're going to reconvene that original group without people knowing by masking them. And then the question is, does, if originally when these 4 people worked together, they, things didn't work out, they did a bad job on their task, is that going to happen again the next time around, given that they don't know that these are the same people? Or, is the heartbreak going to be repeated all over? So the way they did this is, people are in a chat room, and they're just in the chat, they're actually going to manipulate what handles, what names people see. So you might see someone who believes they're called conventional horse. They write, hi there, little snake. But the person they think is little snake is actually named Fast Frog. But what the Fast Frog actually sees is Mighty Pony says, hi there, Fast Frog, right? So, so each person sees their own name correctly, but they're having a substitution for the other person's name. So they actually just don't know, that this person is, that little conventional horse doesn't know that little snake is actually, that, Fast Frog jerk that they didn't like working with before. And Fast Frog doesn't know that, that's, that unreasonable conventional horse person. It's actually, they think it's a Mighty Pony. So there was, so again, chat-based interaction, 140 teams of 3 to 4 people, a series of interactions. This was done on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And hopefully, again, you see how this would be a hard study to do in person, face-to-face. I mean, where you're going to have people actually wear masks and distort their voices. But online, it's actually quite easy. I mean, it's the technology is not trivial, but it is, not that hard. And so they do 4 rounds of 10-minute tasks. And looking at the consistency between 2 rounds of the same team, they had both masked and unmasked experimental conditions. So, for some subjects, they knew they were getting put back into the same team before. For some, they didn't. And importantly, so how they measure, whether the team didn't work out well. Basically, participants were allowed to block collaborators from future tasks, right? So if you just didn't like working with a conventional horse, you could say, I do not want to work with conventional horse again. So that was sort of the outcomers. So the result was actually turns out depended a lot on the kind of task people were trying to do. So we can go read the paper. This is actually one of the earliest really innovative online studies that I was really influenced by. So their basic question here is from Matt Solganic, Peter Dodds, and Duncan Watts. was basically, would Justin Bieber be a hit in all possible worlds? Again, if we reran history, would the same music be popular, same musicians be popular, or is it just a complete random fact that they were popular? So what they did was actually put together a music download site with obscure indie bands, so generally music people weren't going to be familiar with, and it was just a music download site. You could come download music. Unbeknownst to the participants, they were manipulating what you saw about what basically the recommendation system. So you could see information about what other people had downloaded, but you were randomly assigned to one of a number of different worlds. So you would see what people had downloaded, but like only in your individual world. And then there was another baseline condition where you just didn't get any information about what other people downloaded, and so you're finding out what do people download when they don't know what other people are downloading. So here's sort of what the data looked like. X-axis is that independent group, what did people download when they didn't know what other people were keeping, and then y-axis is results for that same piece of music across the various worlds. And you can see at the extremes, like basically the unpopular music just was always unpopular. The really popular music was always popular, but in the middle, it was kind of a random mess, right? So you could have the same song in one world be extremely popular, one of the most popular, another world be one of the least popular. So by the way, so we have Josh DeLeo listening in. All right, do you want to jump in and ask that question?
Sure, yeah. So it was tough because this question came in a little bit after you were done talking about the study because of our lag time on the live stream. But the question was about the previous study, the iterated evolution study that you were talking about, or sorry, the task group study, which is how would you accomplish this thing of bringing back the same group of people to interact at the same time?
Yeah, so it turns out, if you have a server that's tracking things, it's actually not that hard. Basically, you need some sort of server on the back end. I mean, you think about, obviously games do this, all the multiplayer games handle, like if you play like a Nintendo Switch game and you're being randomly assigned other people to play against on the internet, this is sort of a solved problem. Now, the actual programming right now is non-trivial. So there is a project called Empirica that I recommend that has been trying to solve really specifically this sort of problem. But this is something that we're going to see actually through a lot of these examples that I'm giving, that all these things are things that one can do. They aren't they have historically required people to program their own stuff from scratch in a lot of cases. This has definitely been changing over the last few years as we're getting more like sort of well-made, specialized software packages for, say, group experiments like Empirica, or for cultural evolution studies. There is Dallinger, which is really optimized for that. For sort of the viral quiz paradigm, there's Pushkin, which was what we're going to be talking about in the 4th session. And then also just some of the, just stimulus display and response recording has gotten easier because of the growth of things like JS Psych. But one of the things that I will point out, though, is, again, I mean, these studies that, even if you have to, worst case scenario, you have to teach yourself web development to make a study like this. I mean, this like Psycholinguistic study is amazing, right? I mean, there's people who spend their entire careers trying to answer this sort of question. If it took you, how long would it have to take you to put together the study for it to still be worth it? And again, we're trying to speed up how fast it goes, though. This is actually a study that from the people behind Empirica. I do not know if it used Empirica offhand, but they were looking at, sorry, they were looking at basically, can you do better at tasks in a group as opposed to by yourself? So one condition is you're doing a task by yourself, and you get feedback, right? Did you succeed or not? So here we have a whole bunch of people who are not connected to each other. Now you have a connected but static network. So you're interacting with, in this case, 3 other people. They're interacting with 3 other people. There's this like network dynamics, but the network doesn't change over time, right? And then the third option, which is much more realistic, is the network changes, right? So you do a task with some partners and you decide, I like working with these people, or you're like, that person's useless, I don't want to work with them anymore, and you change up who you're working with. So this was actually the task was actually correlation estimation, right? So you're trying to estimate what's the actual correlation coefficient for the scatter plot here. And here's what it looks like to play in the solo condition. You just see a scatter plot and you make your best guess, and you earn money if you get it right, or based on how close you are to being right. Or in the static version, you have 3 other people, and you can see what their guesses are, right? And use that to calibrate your own guess. And they're using your guess to calibrate their guesses, and so on. But in the one with the fluid teams, you can basically choose who to follow, right? So you can say, well, this person's always wrong. I don't want to follow that purple person anymore. So I'm going to unfollow them and try to follow somebody else. And again, you have information on how successful they were on the last trial. And the results are interesting and complex. Again, go read the paper. Why I found this paper exciting to think about and talk about for language people is that I think this issue of looking at, so I think we often see this in language development studies as well, right? With novel languages, either you're having somebody by themselves, they're not actually interacting with anybody else, which is a bit weird. That's not how we use language. Or maybe you have, one of these, team tasks. So you're developing vocabulary with a specific other partner, and maybe we manipulate who you can work with. But of course, in real life, people get to choose to a large degree who they talk to. And I think that this paradigm would be very interesting to understand how that affects some of that cultural evolution studies that we were talking about earlier. Probably, though, the most prolific use of, one of the places where online experiments has had the biggest impact has actually been in lifespan development. So typical studies of development and aging have, 2, maybe 3 age groups. So that I'm not picking on anybody else, I'm going to pick on myself. Here's a study I did with 3 age groups: 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and adults. And by adult, of course, I mean college student. Now you can try to do better by doing some meta-analysis. So here's a meta-analysis I did where we're looking at a few different ages for, in this case, pronoun interpretation. The problem is that if everybody's testing roughly the same ages, then collapsing across a bunch of studies doesn't help you very much, right? So if people are pretty much only testing, little kids, college students, and retirees, then that's what you can look at, even in meta-analysis. Now, there have been a few over the years, heroic efforts that looked at much wider age ranges, but for a relatively small number of tasks, and usually with really not that many subjects per cell, and so statistical comparison gets tricky. So again, what we've known about lifespan development across lifespan has really been about what we know about kids up to the age of 5, college students, and retirees, and really mostly college students, right? That's the vast majority of all human subject data. So anyway, there's now been a lot of studies that by being run online and getting a large number of subjects from, usually you can get data down to like 8, 9 years old in these viral quizzes, and then up into the 70s or 80s. We're getting much more precise, graphs of how various cognitive abilities and capacities change over the lifespan. Here's a schematic that I put together for a talk recently. So I don't have the raw data for all these studies, so I can't actually put them on the same slide. But sort of, what we've been seeing across the different studies I know of looks something like this, which is complicated, right? So the old story about development and aging was there was really two components, fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence peaks early, crystallized intelligence peaks late. Whereas what it really looks like is there's stuff peaking all over the place. And right now we still don't really know why. But basically we've had to toss out the older theories of development and aging and are working on new ones. Which is, again, not shocking because, again, our old theories were based on a really like small amount of data effectively, looking at primarily a few ages. Something that is a project of mine that I think, I think is an example of the kinds of things hopefully we'll be able to do more of, is looking at critical periods. I mean, this paper was looking at critical periods, but I think the what we do here is maybe a little bit broader. So one of the things about looking at critical periods in language is there are three critical variables you care about, right? So there's somebody's current age. There's the age at which they started learning the language in question, and how many years of experience they have in that language. And obviously all these matter, right? So we know current age is going to affect, for instance, cognitive decline or maturity or whatever. Onset age is, of course, the thing that we really care about. How does the age at which you start learning matter? And then years of experience. Obviously, the more years you've been working with the language, the better you're going to be. And the problem is that these are linearly related, right? So you can't actually deconfound them experimentally. Once you know two, you know the third. So what we did was get a huge number of subjects that varied in their current age, the number of years they had been learning English in this case. And oh, I deleted the legend there. Sorry about that. The different colors are different onset ages. So red was actually people started at age 0. The sort of like orangish brown is between 1 and 10. Green is 11 to 20. Blue is after 20. And you can see that actually the rate at which people are learning English is declining for these, for blue relative to orange and red. People who started later are learning less quickly. So we had some math to try to decompose, again, these linearly related factors. And this is our best estimate for learning rate, looking like you're actually starting to slow down at the rate you can learn grammar, in this case, syntax, at about 17 to 18 years old. And again, this is something we could only do because we had enormous numbers of subjects varying in current age, age of onset age, and years of experience. And when I say huge numbers, these graphs here depict, I believe, about a little over 600,000 subjects, so not something we could easily do in the laboratory. So,
hey Josh,
yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
So I saw a question go by on the YouTube chat, which I think is relevant to the study you just discussed. And the person just asked, what are viral quizzes? What do you mean by that?
Great. Okay, so these are quizzes that you may have seen on Facebook or elsewhere online. It's answer these questions and we will tell you we'll tell you like what your personality type is, or which Simpsons character you most resemble, or which Harry Potter house you should you're really part of, etc., stuff like that. So these when I say like viral specifically, I mean something that goes viral, right? So you have large numbers, maybe millions of people do. But that's what they tend to look like, relatively short quizzes that get shared a lot on Facebook. Okay, so cross-cultural studies is another place where there's been, which is really obvious application for online studies, right? So usually the difficulty with cross-cultural studies is it's easiest to test the people who live nearby your laboratory. And travel is expensive, and even if you could travel, you go someplace, you have to find a way of recruiting subjects there. But if half of the world is online, it is true, it is hard. If you want to study hunter-gatherers, this is maybe my ignorance, I suspect most of them don't have 5G, but a lot of the world that you can reach without leaving home. So And people have done some pretty cool stuff with this. So here's one of my favorite studies out of Laura Germain's lab. So Laura Germain actually, who's at McLean Hospital, has probably, in terms of the the viral quiz methodology, particularly used to look at demographic differences like age or culture, does the best work. So I'd check her stuff out if you're interested. So what they did here was they were looking at sustained attentional control. So just like a standard intentional control study experiment, and looking at the sex differences in attentional control in a population and correlating that with various interesting demographic factors about that correlation, right? So here, for instance, we have sex differences by country against levels of poverty. And you can see poverty actually doesn't seem to be playing a big role here. But they looked at a bunch of other things. The one that actually ended up being a big deal, which is that the third one from the top says high quality, low quality. That's actually equality in the workforce. So how equal is the gender representation in the workforce? And that actually seemed to correlate fairly strongly with sex differences in attentional control. Another really neat one so this group has done a lot of really interesting work with these massive personality tests where they have millions of subjects. And what they looked at is they actually, in the US, mapped basically big 5 personality metrics across population centers in the United States. And then they can ask for an individual in that population, how is their self-esteem depend on basically how well their personality fits the population. And that's what that graph on the right there is. And then they did this for all of the big 5 and also emotional stability and religiosity. So that was a pretty neat study. And again, example of the kinds of things that you can do that maybe you hadn't even thought of doing when you have these very large demographically diverse populations, samples. Something that puts these last 2 together is cross-cultural development. I know of only one, there's only one of these studies that's really stuck out to me so far. And again, this may be ignorance, or probably other interesting ones. But this is from that same group, again, looking at personality maturation around the world. And they didn't have a really succinct graph, but the takeaway is cultures with an earlier onset of adult role responsibilities were marked by earlier personality maturation. So people tend to, hit whatever their adult, big 5 personality is going to be at an earlier age in places where you basically become an adult earlier. Which is not necessarily shocking, although it wouldn't have been shocking if it was the other way around. Again, I think there's a lot of things like this that you could imagine doing, including in the language sphere, in terms of looking at, we often say that all languages are equally easy to learn, but I don't know if that's true. And even if it were true, I don't know if it's equally easy to learn languages in every culture. But it's an enormously difficult thing to study. I mean, certainly on a broad scale, languages are equally easy to learn. We don't see places where your 40-year-olds are still struggling with basic grammar. But that doesn't mean there aren't theoretically interesting differences, as there are, I think, in this case. Something else that I think has gotten underappreciated, but maybe the most important on the list, is the ability to work with many, many stimuli. So the best study along these lines, sort of the most compelling study I know of, is this one from Tom Griffith's group. And they looked at basically some standard decision-making under uncertainty, right? So you can choose A, you'll get 16 points with a probability of 1, right? So you definitely get 16 points. With B, you don't know how many points you're going to get. There's some probability, right? And we know that under different circumstances, people will prefer the risky choice or the safe choice, right? But in terms of, so there's obviously essentially an unlimited number of comparisons you could make here, right? So the task is such that there's an infinite number of probabilities and numbers you could put behind A and B. And in terms of what's actually been tested, it kind of feels like a random walk, right? So people, test something, they get, some set of stimuli, they get some interesting results. Some other people come along and based on that, test some other stimuli, and so on. And it's not clear how well we're actually covering the the space. Now you could do a grid search, right? Which is you try to do like equally spaced, samples, but in a really high dimensional space that gets hard quickly. They used an enormous Amazon Mechanical Turk study to, this is basically the sample space of possible risky choice tasks mapped onto 2 dimensions. In red are the classic experiments that have been done and justified, say, prospect theory. In blue was the largest prior study that had tried doing basically kind of grid search. Black is what they tested. You can see they tested an enormously larger number of points. What you find from this graph, so expected utility theory is in blue. So this is like how well, so error is up, so down is good. How well does expected utility theory do as a function of how many data points you're training on, right, to fit the parameters of expected utility? That's blue. Green is just, try to, well, let's ignore green, it's boring. Purple is prospect theory. You can see it's a little bit better. Black, the straight black line there was the best recent model. And red is actually just training a neural network on the data. And you can see that, with small amounts of data, a small number of samples in the stimulus space, actually prospect theory does quite well. This like beast model, which is based on like all the data that had been available before, does pretty well, but it's really overfit. They're all really overfit to small numbers of stimuli that have been tested. And you get, again, like neural network, who knows what it's learning? The point is that you can't, like there is a much better theory out there that you're only going to find if you have a lot more data. You had a question, Josh?
Well, I'm not. I was waiting to see where you're going to go next to see if it was a good fit. But sure. So I think this is related to these studies where you have lots and lots of stimuli that you might want to be testing. So in the lab we deal with this by picking a particular design because we know roughly how many subjects we're going to recruit. But when we go online, we have this issue where we now don't know how many people are going to participate. So how do we deal with this? How do we choose the number of stimuli to show a participant, for example, or which stimuli to show a participant when we don't know how many participants there are going to be?
So that is tricky. It's less tricky on a labor market like Amazon Mechanical Turk, where we know a bit more about how many you can get. So we know, for instance, if you're running a study over a period of about half a year, you probably can get on the order of 7,000 subjects in Amazon Mechanical Turk. So you should plan on that being your limit. But for like the viral quizzes, I mean, you don't know what's going to go viral. There is the sort of thinking about it hard method, and then there's the AI method. And I will say the AI method is something that people have been thinking about for a long time and has not really been, I think, really well successfully implemented a bunch. The thinking about it hard is basically design your study in such a way that, basically any stopping point will be good. Right, so if I design a study that needs 500,000 subjects, I know I may not get 500,000 subjects. So I'll ask, all right, well, what could I do with these data if I only had 10,000? So I can usually, just because of the kind of historical traffic now Games with Words has, and our mailing list and whatnot, and some experience, I know that I can usually get I know how to get 10,000 subjects. But past that, it's a gamble. So you design with, well, if I only had 10,000, here's what I make sure that I've prioritized things correctly for that first 10,000, just in case. The AI method is, and there's been a lot of people exploring this. And again, I think Dallinger is the platform to look at here. And from Jordan Sakow and Tom Griffiths, which is to try to basically use machine learning to prioritize stimuli. So you can actually, if you have a theory or if you have some model you're trying to fit, right, you can actually calculate an expected utility of getting the results for a particular stimulus. So how much, depending, averaging over how the results might come out, how much do you expect to learn? How much would that help you fit your model? And you can prioritize your data collection that way. And in principle, you can update it as you're going, right? So after getting one response, you update and now see what's the most useful data point to look at next. Now, what Jordan has told me is that in practice, that seems to not actually be all that valuable at the cost of a whole lot of computation. And just before starting to run the study, calculating what are the at that point, what are going to be the most useful stimuli to look at seems to work pretty well. But again, I think this is something that the literature on this goes under the term active learning and artificial intelligence. This is something that obviously people in machine learning are quite interested in, but it's something that like we've played around with. Haven't done a whole lot, in part because I've never been able to get a grant to actually implement or work on active learning. That's the idea. The one thing you want to be really careful about, this would be the worst potential, well, depending on what you're trying to do, this might be the worst thing you could do, right? So let's say you had a whole bunch of stimuli, let's say 10,000 stimuli, 10,000 words, right? And you wanted to get lexical decision accuracies for each of those words, right? So you don't want just one subject to do each word. That's not going to be very helpful, right? That all that you'll have is, half, some portion of them, 100% of subjects got right, and some portion of them, 0% of subjects got right. You probably have, some number of subjects that you sort of need for each item. Let's say you need 50, right? You would not want to randomly sample for each subject. You wouldn't want to randomly sample items, right? Because then you're really committing to, we had 10,000 items, we need 50 per item. You're really committing to getting 50,000 responses. But what happens if you only get 10,000 responses? You would probably want to walk through the stimuli one at a time, or a few at a time. Make sure that you got up to 50 on some stimuli before going on. And then again, you have to figure out how to prioritize which stimuli to look at. The other people who've been working on this problem in sort of the online research spaces, Zooniverse has some folks working on it. Again, they don't do experiments per se. They do mostly, you think of it as data coding. So actually, there haven't been people who have used Zooniverse for linguistic annotation, but I think it's something that they're interested in. I think is actually probably a really good idea because they have a really nice setup for it. I think, a couple of years ago, I was working on building my own, and now I'm kind of like, we're just going to use theirs. Theirs is really good. And they are working on building in some of this AI stuff in the background. Anyway, so large numbers of subjects. So the thing all I have to say about large numbers of subjects after this is just since, again, this is a language-themed workshop, because that's where our funding comes from. I want to point out that I actually also have a study kind of like this on implicit causality for people familiar with that. It's pronoun interpretation phenomenon, where also it turned out that basically prior theories were based on a kind of random walk, right? So Alfonso Karamazza and Catherine Garvey tested some stimuli. Later, Roger Brown and Deborah Fish tested some other stimuli actually independently. And people after that basically chose their stimuli, sort of either based on or responding to the prior stimuli, and fitting, their theories to that. And it turns out that all prior theories, at the time we published this, when we then tested on a larger sample of stimuli, prior theories were, for the most part, at or below chance in predicting the results. But I don't have any particularly nice graphs. I really like the one that I just showed you from Tom's paper. And I kind of want to actually do that for this paper retroactively now, but I haven't done it yet. And I would be shocked if this was the exception rather than the norm. I think when we start going from, I think at the time I ran this study, something like 300 stimuli ever had been tested, and we tested like over 1,000. And again, we just saw something completely different from what people had seen before. And I would be surprised if that doesn't keep on happening. And I think that's something that for online studies is something that's sort of low-hanging fruit that we should pay attention to. And this is something that Tom Griffiths has been saying quite a lot. Even if you're doing Amazon Mechanical Turk studies, you really want to consider doing an order of magnitude more subjects in order to do an order of magnitude more stimuli. Because you might think, well, that's expensive, right? I'm paying subjects. But you also want to think about your own time or your grad students or postdocs' time. How expensive is that? Relative, most laboratories spend the 95% of their funds on salaries. So you may actually find that papers become easier to write and easier to get published if you spend a bit more on subjects. Something else, this was a neat study that came out a few years ago. It was basically a massive lexical decision task that they used to estimate how many words English speakers know. And of course, you have this problem of when you're doing this estimation, how do you sample from the words, right? Because, do you look at only very low frequency words? If you're looking only at low frequency, they're very low frequency. So anyway, by being able to test a very large number of subjects and spread out a very large number of words across them, they were able to estimate that the typical English speaker knows around 46,000 words. And again, that was from sampling 62,000 words over, over 200,000 subjects. And then, so this is, I believe, my last part of this section, and then we're going to take a break, which I couldn't come up with a good name for it, but sort of like science on the move. This is sort of collecting data from people going about their sort of normal, behavior out in the world. So probably the thing that you may be most familiar with are Lena studies, where you strap a recorder onto a baby for a day. And that usually requires like, buying the recorders and sending it to people. But, lots of people are actually walking around with all kinds of recording equipment all the time. So here, I just learned about this study yesterday. I think this is super cool. This was, subjects were recruited in a more standard way, but they basically had an app on their phone. So they were recruited through a normal like lab procedure, but they had an app on their phone that just like, reported their mobility data, right? So this is, where somebody went, 4 different people went on a given day around Manhattan. So they ran some of their subjects in New York, and I believe some in somewhere in Florida. I forget where exactly. And every day they asked them basically, how happy are you? Right, and they got about 80 days worth of data per person, 132 subjects. And what they found was roaming entropy. So the number of sort of distinct neighborhoods that somebody went through was even controlling for sort of obvious other things like temperature and precipitation and whatnot, a really good predictor of how happy somebody was. And it was a predictor that day. So how much you roamed yesterday did not predict how happy you were today, controlling for how much you roamed today. How happy you were yesterday didn't predict how much you roamed today, conditioned on how happy you are today. So it really seemed to be basically like, go out and have a good walk, it'll make you happy. And though this was the cool part, this is why they had to do it in sort of a more lab-based recruitment strategy, is they also neuroimaged these people. And they found that ventral striatal hippocampal connectivity predicted how much roaming entropy predicted happiness. So this was, I thought, a super interesting study. And again, the kind of thing that is sort of very possible right now. And it's almost, kind of strange that, there aren't thousands of these studies until you remember that, again, we're, not inventing the field right now, right? We have both the benefits of the 150 years of institutional knowledge, but also the baggage, right? The blinders on, this is the way we've always done things. These are the questions we always ask. These are the way we always do our studies. The other one that I have to mention, because we're trying to recruit subjects right now, so if you got kids, check out kidtalkscrapbook.org. this is really sort of like social media style study. We'll see how it goes. It's basically an app where you can make an audio scrapbook. So here's my audio scrapbook as of like a little while ago of conversations with my toddler. And you can share your scrapbook with basically whoever you want to. So that's sort of like the social media part. This is really inspired by something my family was already doing on Instagram. We're rolling out new features constantly. So hopefully in a couple weeks, it's going to look a bit more like this, where you have like comments and discussions about the recordings. I think that's going to be really important. Just as not just as an experimenter, but as a user of this app, I think that's going to make it more interesting. But again, I guess what I want to focus on here is that parents are already recording their children all the time, right? And they're sharing those recordings with their family and friends, whether the family and friends want it or not, all the time. And when you think about it, that is data that as language acquisition for language acquisition researchers, we need. And it's there. People are making it all the time. And so how do we sort of get even just like a little trickle of that activity, going our way into research? So some features of these like motivating examples, you see a number of them really made good use of large diverse samples. Some complex randomization or logic. Also manipulating, so group behavior and manipulated group behavior, again, in ways that's just really hard to do in the laboratory, in part because I don't know how many people here have done group experiments, but your biggest problem is people not showing up, and so you don't have enough people for the group. Then obviously it's hard to actually intervene on the group behavior in the way that we saw. And also these dense longitudinal studies. And I think this is probably really the tip of the iceberg. I think there are probably an enormous range of exciting paradigms we could be using online and aren't, because A, we haven't thought about it, and B, there's this technical challenge, which is part of what this workshop is, of course, designed to help the field address the technical challenge and the training challenge that we have as we're going from having done studies one particular way with one set of technologies to a different way with a different set. Okay, and so we're going to take a break for a few minutes. I can answer questions in the meantime. We'll do about a 5-minute break, and this is what we'll be on. What kind of sort of like the sort of like nitty gritty next.
Okay, I've got a few questions in the queue. So they're all pretty sort of general.
Right.
So one kind of general category that we've been seeing is how do you design longitudinal studies online and convince people to come back?
Well, so I think we will talk about this some more in the recruitment section, but I will start with like clearly it is possible in the sense that people play online games repeatedly for weeks at a time, all the time, right? People use educational apps regularly for periods of time. People use weight loss apps regularly for periods of time. What is, of course, salient about those 3 examples I just gave, which is all of those involve doing stuff that people want to do. I think that there's actually, the amount of money you have to pay somebody such that they are really motivated to do like a long longitudinal study can be, quite a lot. Whereas people will literally pay to play games if they're good games. So I think, so you saw what we were trying to do with Kid Talk. I think that it is a sort of open challenge. People have been able to do multi-session experiments on Amazon Mechanical Turk, but not necessarily, with like 4 or 5 sessions, but that's not necessarily longitudinal. And I think it would be very hard to do on Amazon Mechanical Turk because the population seems to turn over almost entirely every 6 months.
The next general set of questions, there's been a lot of questions about getting kids to do online study.
Yes. So for, as I said, the like viral quiz method works for certainly 10 on up. You can, in some studies, folks have gotten enough like 8 and 9-year-olds to be useful. Younger than that, you run into this issue that little kids just aren't on the web. And so they're not going to see viral quizzes and participate. Plus, like, they'd have to be able to read, etc. There are, of course, so there are people who are doing, trying to set up, Zoom chats to do experiments that way. I don't know how successful that's been. It's probably, in the midst of a pandemic, worth trying. There is, I'm just blanking on the name, Lookit from Kim Scott's the lead researcher on that at MIT, where they've been trying to basically, they have like a plug and play system, which is not, I believe, open yet, but should be open soon to researchers, to basically do sort of preferential looking studies for the most part over the internet. And again, recruitment, it's hard to get large numbers, probably again, because I just don't think there's a huge population of parents out there who are desperate for, preferential looking studies to do with their kids. Parents are pretty busy. However, I do know kids are on mobile apps all the time. And I think the first person who figures out how to, make an interesting mobile app that little kids want to use and that their parents are happy to let them use is going to have a really cool study. And that is, but I think that remains an unsolved problem. Something else, that people have used is basically hire people on Amazon Mechanical Turk who have kids, right? Because on Turk, everybody has to be 18 or older. But if they have a kid, you potentially basically can hire parents so you can test their kids. But there's not a huge number of again, the population is just not that large. That's also something people try. We probably have time for one more.
So I think the third general category is if you're thinking about taking a classical study that's in the lab and sort of adopting the gamification approach. Maybe there's sort of two questions here. So what do we mean by gamification? Like, what does that look like? Because I think my initial reaction is that maybe it's not not the default that we think about. It's not just like making it have a score or something like that. But also, are there tools that let you do the gamification? So if you're not a game programmer, how could you put together a gamified study?
So some simple gamification, like giving people scores, is the sort of stuff that we have been trying to implement in Pushkin. Maybe I will have a demo of this on, in 2 weeks. We have plugins for it, but it's a question of whether we'll have them working on the new, easier to use version that we're teaching people in 2 weeks. But we'll certainly have them before long. But if you want to actually do a game, there are a lot of good packages for writing games. Actually, I want to ask you, Josh, this one. You've done a lot more of this than me.
Yeah. So I have students in my lab. We develop games that sort of look and feel more like a casual game that you might download on your phone or something like that. It takes a long time to build these. We've been working on it for 3 years, and we still don't actually have like an experiment out of it. So I think there's a question about.
Quick break in, just because not everybody knows, when Josh says students, he means undergrads.
Yes, that's true. These are all undergraduate researchers at Vassar College. So we use HTML and CSS and JavaScript to build the games. We sometimes use JSPsych as an engine to help us navigate through the games, especially if the games kind of have like a level or trial like structure, even if it's kind of under the guise of a video game. Say like a game where there's a maze that you have to solve, and you could design that as a plugin in JSPsych, and then you could patch together lots of mazes to solve for somebody. But there's also lots of JavaScript libraries out there specifically for game design. So there's a library called Phaser that I know people have used for research. There's Unity, which people are using to build like 3D worlds that can be used for things like spatial cognition research. So there's tools out there for game design. whether they're accessible to somebody who's not a programmer, I mean, there's probably a pretty big investment that has to be made in terms of time and getting up to speed before you're ready to do that kind of thing. But it is possible to do like the full game development thing and turn that into an experiment. But I guess I wanted to sort of emphasize with this question that it's not necessary to build something that feels like a game to have a really successful online experiment. I mean, a lot of the really successful things that Josh has been talking about, they're not like lab experiments, but they're also not like online video games. They're something else. There's like this third category of thing that they can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely right. Okay, so let's talk about some of the nitty gritty, what you can actually do. So I feel like the question, what data can you collect? Really, it's a more complicated question. There's what data can you collect with ease, right? So text and mouse responses is a solved problem. That's straightforward, tons of software for doing that. Touch screen, for the most part, is not too bad. Drag and drop sorting, there's a plugin in JS Psych for this. So again, I would look at JS Psych for, a lot of the sort of standard things that you might want to do, like self-paced reading or whatnot. I mean, that's all straightforward, as long as it involves a keyboard or a mouse, maybe a touch screen. Real-time interviews, as I mentioned, people are doing, where you basically just like get people to sign up for a time when you call them on Skype. And you can get reaction times on keyboard and mouse, and you can get pretty good reaction times. And this is something that I know a lot of, just from the surveys we've done, there are a lot of people who are skeptical of. But I want to point out, actually back in this early slide, I was talking about these various studies. This one here is the first reaction time study I know of. So it's actually from Project Implicit. What do they call it? The IAT Implicit Attitudes Test, which requires like fairly fine-grained reaction times. And they were getting good data back again at the turn of the century. So the most useful information we have about this is, like most recent is from this preprint you can find. I will say this is from the people who did this study do have a paid service for online studies. So they obviously have a conflict of interest. Whether you think that affects any of the results, I don't see. The results look consistent with earlier studies, so I'm not concerned about it personally, but it's FYI. And they looked at Psycho.js, which is their program, CyclePy, but the JavaScript version, JS Psych, Gorilla, Testable, and Lab.js. And here, for instance, is and in a bunch of different browsers on different hardware, right? Because this is actually one of the complicated things is that different hardware works slightly differently. If you're running a study in the laboratory, all right, you have everybody on the same computer running the same software. But online, people are using different browsers, they're using different hardware, and there's going to be some variation. So anyway, this looks at, you can think of this as the amount of noise in a keyboard reaction time in milliseconds. And we have a histogram here. So, basically all the different platforms I looked at had less than 10 milliseconds of variance. Right, so in noise, most of the data is going to be within a few milliseconds of the actual correct reaction time, except for something I'm going to talk about next, right? This is actually just like the variation. For visual duration variance, like you ask something to be on the screen for 100 milliseconds, how long is it actually on there? Your plus minus is going to be, again, on the order of, a few milliseconds for the most part. There was one software by hardware by browser combination that wasn't as good. But actually, 30 milliseconds is not that bad. And then here's audio-visual offset. So if you're showing something visually and playing sound, how synced are they? And the variation in the synchronization is, again, pretty small, right? So this is like trial-to-trial noise is small. What's complicated is that all these have lags. So here's, for instance, the reaction time lag. So your software is telling you this person responded in 200 milliseconds. More likely, they responded in 240 milliseconds. So it tends to be a lag. The numbers are inflated. Now, again, they are inflated in a very consistent way, right? So here is the variance on the same scale, right? So, if a particular platform is 40 milliseconds slow, it tends to be 40 milliseconds slow plus or minus a couple milliseconds. And we'll get back to what that means in a second. Visual duration bias, this is basically how, like, you wanted your stimulus to display for 100 milliseconds. How long did it actually display? For the most part, about 100 milliseconds, but for some of these platform combinations, it might be, 20 milliseconds longer, it might be, 10 milliseconds shorter. But again, without a whole lot of variation in that, right? That's what I had showed you previously, was that the trial-to-trial differences are small, but there is this sort of like main effect, potentially. The one that is actually the most potentially problematic is the audio lag. So the audio tends to, if you wanted audio and visual to start at the same time, audio tends to lag on most of these platforms. Now, for the most part, less than 100 milliseconds. In a few cases, again, they were seeing a consistent lag that was longer than that. And again, if you go back and look at the trial-to-trial variation, which we looked at before, it's pretty small, right? So again, if it's, if the audio is lagging by 100 milliseconds, it probably continues to lag by about 100 milliseconds in every trial. So what does this mean? Well, I gave you, so I've made this nice handy flow chart. So is your experiment within subjects? Well, let's say yes, it's within subjects. Well, then does it involve subliminal priming masking? Let's say no. Do you need really tight audio-visual synchronization, right? Like, do you need it to be on the order of tens of milliseconds? Are you comfortable with a 100 millisecond offset? Or are you just like not synchronizing audio and visual stimuli? Then you're probably fine to go, right? Most of these cases, if there's, the other answer, so if you're doing a between subjects experiment, right, that does not randomize people across conditions, and the effects that you're interested in are smaller than 50 milliseconds, then you may need to proceed with some caution. This doesn't mean you can't do the study, but you'll want to be careful about, for instance, keeping track of what browsers and hardware people are using. So here's sort of the concern you could have, which is, let's say you're doing an aging study, right? You're comparing like young adults and older adults, and you find like a 20 millisecond difference. Well, this might be because your older adults are all using Internet Explorer, which is old and terrible and probably has a longer lag. You would actually have to go back and look at the numbers, but it would not be crazy to see a 20 millisecond effect just because your different subjects are using different equipment. But again, if you had like, a 1 second effect, or even frankly, 100 millisecond effect, it's probably not the software, right? It's probably not the differences in the software. If you are randomizing people across conditions, again, then all you're doing is adding some noise. But on the whole, again, it's pretty small, right? We're talking on the order of tens of milliseconds. So again, if you're doing, now if you're doing, masked priming or something, I might start to worry about, did you actually get the stimuli displayed for exactly the right amount of time? Was the mask actually working? And again, it's not that I don't think we can solve this. We have some thoughts about how to solve it. And if you can convince any funders to pay for us to solve it, we'd love to, but we haven't done it yet. But for most things that you might want to do, generally the reaction times and timing are pretty good. Yeah, and so again, you may have a little bit more noise than you're used to. Maybe, again, like I would actually check and see just how noisy the data is that you're collecting in the laboratory. It's not perfect either, but you might want to do some power analyses to see whether you need, how many more subjects you need, or better yet, just test a whole bunch of subjects to begin with. So anyway, that was the stuff that sort of can be done, sort of with ease. Most software packages, certainly JS Psych, are going to let you do these things. With work, you can record audio. So most software packages don't have this built in. Most are working on it. I know, Josh can jump in if he wants to just say something about recording audio in JS Psych, because it's something that he's been thinking about.
Yeah, well, I was just going to actually say that Becky, who was co-presenting with me last week, she's been working on a plugin that you can find on the JS Psych discussion group that has a audio recording system that she's been beta testing now for a while. We also had a question in the chat that's related to recording audio, which is whether it's possible to collect audio data that's high enough quality that you could do detailed acoustic phonetic analysis is the direct quote, I think.
That I think requires more knowledge of detailed phonetic and acoustic analysis than I have. But I think if you can record, so if the quality that you get on, say, a Zoom call or a Skype call is sufficient, then yes, definitely. You can probably do better than that as well, right? But that would start being a technology question. I don't know, what do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I also don't know enough about it. I think you're right, though. If you can get it on Zoom, it's definitely possible, and I agree that you can probably do better, because I think you could not compress it when you record it through. So as long as it probably depends a lot on the participant setup, like whether their audio equipment is good enough for what you want to do.
Yeah, so when I say with work here, I mean, this is sort of like intuitive judgment I'm going to have with a whole lot of work coming up. It's really like, how many existing libraries are there already for doing this sort of stuff? So there's a lot of really good JavaScript libraries for processing audio, right? So, would somebody who doesn't know how to program, would they be able to do this? Well, they'd have to first learn to program or find someone who can, right? But somebody who knows how to program and is willing to put in a little bit of time should not have much difficulty, for instance, writing something that would do the acoustic analysis to the extent you can do it automatically. If you can do it automatically on the client side, so on your subject's computer, then you don't have to deal with uploading very, very large raw audio files, which is generally going to be the most difficult thing. Also, you will have just scored major brownie points with the IRB, right? Because the IRB does start getting more worried when you're recording video and audio. If you can analyze it on the machine of the subject and only get the results of the analysis and not get the actual raw data, then suddenly you've just made your study anonymous, which is awesome, right? And that tends to solve a lot of IRB issues, which we will get to shortly. And sorry, I gotta dismiss this notification. All right. So same with recording video. Again, I think there's perfectly good packages out there for doing this. There are, like I said, like Lookit is already recording video. I don't think this would be incredibly challenging, but it's not something that right now is sort of supported out of the box. I think by, I would say by anybody, but especially the commercial platforms, the platforms that are charging money have been very rapidly trying to roll out new abilities over the last couple months for the obvious reasons. So, anything I say could be out of date at this point. Eye tracking, similarly, it's actually been about 5 years now that there's been, technical reports on doing not eye tracking at the quality you would want for eye tracking while reading, right? That's going to be very hard with a webcam. But if you're doing preferential looking or if you're doing, sort of like standard visual world paradigm studies, you can certainly get, quadrants without much difficulty. And there's been some nice validation studies. I do not know of anyone who's actually incorporated this into like a real psycholinguistic study and published yet. But I think the big problem there is actually going to be handling lighting on the subject side, right? So anyone who's done eye tracking knows that lighting can be nasty. That's something that again, like various people associated with JS Psych have been looking into for a little while now, and hopefully we'll have something to say. I know that one of the commercial platforms, Josh may be able to jump in and say who it is, says they have eye tracking now, but I don't remember which one that is.
I think Gorilla is beta testing or private testing. I'm not sure where they're at. I haven't tried it myself, but I know that it's something that they've been playing with.
Yeah, and so Rachel Riskin's the person who's really been taking lead on thinking about eye tracking and JS Psych. Should be the person to check in with for people who are interested. Mouse tracking, again, I mean, the information is basically there. You just have to record it. I don't think that JSPsych has a mouse checking plugin right now, but it would not be that hard to make one. Drawing, similarly, a number of people have done studies involving drawing. It's sort of straightforward. I don't believe it is built into any packet, like any of the online software packages right now, but it's, again, for someone who can do some programming and willing to learn some, JavaScript, it should not be awful. Now, this is stuff with difficulty is stuff that, certainly can be done, people have done, but I've personally been nervous about trying it because I think it's going to be a lot of work. One is GPS. We saw an example of that. Heart rate monitoring. Obviously, there's a lot of people walking around with heart rate monitors these days. In principle, it should be possible to, get that data from them if they want it. But I just don't know enough about how to do that to know for sure how easy that would be to set up. And that's sort of in general for wearables. So wearables are able to share data, but I don't know how hard that is to set up. Body orientation, right? There's various, again, wearables that do body orientation, but also, various game consoles like Kinect or whatnot will get, body orientation, limb movements and things like that. Those are all, connected to the internet. So in principle, you should be able to do, massively distributed experiments. But again, I have no idea like how complicated that would be to set up. I just know that it's, obviously the technology is there to do any of this. Maybe soon. This is one that I've been saying maybe soon for some years now and has not gotten any sooner. So I don't know. But there are commercial, EEG sets out there for like home use. So right now you can buy like this on Amazon for $140, has a couple electrodes. I don't think this one is networked, but because of the same people who they have a whole bunch of downloadable apps for playing, I guess, phone games with an EEG sensor. I think this company, I'm not sure, the last time they tweeted was 2 years ago, so I don't know what that means. There's a number of other companies that have similarly been demoing, you may have seen them at conferences, demoing games with EEG consoles. Once that, becomes available and widely available, I suspect that it's coming. I just don't know how long. And I didn't put on this list. I think I missed it. Virtual reality. So I saw a paper recently with somebody who was doing, one of those phone-based virtual reality, setups, doing experiments over the internet with that. It's certainly that may actually be easy. I don't know. It's just really the stuff that's on with difficulty is the stuff that I don't personally know how to do, right? So maybe actually is easy. So data quality best practices. How do you make sure you're not getting junk? And this is something that people have been worried about. How do I know that it's not just a bunch of chimpanzees typing on keyboards? And this is something that folks have, certainly who are new to the space have worried about from the beginning and continue to worry about. And when you think about it, again, we know that the internet is not entirely made of chimpanzees, typing randomly on keyboards, because people are doing all kinds of very real stuff on the internet all the time. They're buying things, they're taking classes, they are, resolving disputes about who it was in that movie or who wrote that book. They're banking, they are filing their taxes, they are watching really interesting, web seminars. So it's clearly possible for people on the internet to follow instructions, to be serious, et cetera, et cetera. So the real question is only, are your incentives and spam filters sufficient, right? Are people really properly incentivized to give you good data? And are you weeding out, the bad actors? It turns out there aren't that many bad actors, but they can be really annoying when you run into them. So the take-home message that I really want, and I'm going to go into some best practices, but the take-home message is data quality matches or exceeds that of the laboratory. And this has always been true, right? This is probably the single, other than the Stroop effect, probably the single most studied question in the history of psychology. And it is really well established that data quality matches or exceeds that of the lab. If you use best practices, and maybe even if you don't. And also volunteers probably produce higher quality data than what you get in the laboratory. So again, Amazon Mechanical Turk subjects, depending on what study you look at and like when you do it, there's been, certainly discussion about maybe quality has been going down recently, although then AMT just like put in a whole bunch of new filters, so maybe it's going back up. I don't know. Maybe they're not quite as good as the laboratory without, having some decent spam filters. But volunteer subjects tend to, really produce higher quality data. They seem to be paying better attention. And you think about it, it makes sense, right? Incentives are aligned. These are folks who actually, like, if you've developed your volunteer, like they're only doing the study because they want to do the study, not because they want $5 or course credit. And if they don't want to do the study, they just quit. So how do I, but let's talk about some specific questions that people might have and how to handle them. So one people worry about a lot is how do I prevent my subjects from lying? And the answer is, to start with, mostly they don't. So again, there's lots of work on this. People are reasonably honest, but probably don't pay people to lie. And you might think, I wouldn't pay people to lie. Yeah, you probably would, right? So in a study that actually checked, around 20 to 50% of AMT subjects lied about eligibility if the eligibility was something that like most people wouldn't have. To get, and this will be, again, it depends on, the situation. So some years ago, I tried to run a study in Japanese on Amazon Mechanical Turk. Now, there are not a lot of Japanese speakers in Amazon Mechanical Turk, but I was hopeful. Well, anyway, I got 20 subjects to do it. Not a single one of them knew Japanese, right? So they were chimpanzees typing randomly on keyboards or the next best thing. And that was probably because, again, like all the conscientious subjects are like, I don't know Japanese. But with 7,000 people online, a couple of them are going to be like, well, maybe it'll pay me anyway. Type. Anyway, so people will, if you are basically saying, I will only pay you if you answer a question a particular way, and you tell them how you want them to answer the question, there are a certain percentage of people who will answer the question that way. So you want to think about that. Even if you don't set it up that way. So we've definitely seen subjects on Amazon Mechanical Turk may be, like if you ask, are you a native monolingual English speaker, they may worry that you are going to reject them if they say no, right? So something we always do is when we're doing Amazon Mechanical Turk studies is say, something along the lines of, are you interested in how differences between people affects how they understand language? We are too. Please answer these questions so we understand better what your background is like, and just make it clear to them that we're not going to be using this to toss them out. Does this mean that occasionally you're paying for data that you don't want? Yes, but better than having data that's wrong. And again, this is just not as much of an issue on volunteer studies because people just don't have an incentive to lie. The other thing you can do, and this turns out to work remarkably well, is just ask them if they're lying at the end. By the way, did you tell the truth about everything? And a decent portion of people who are lying will actually tell you they were lying, which is helpful. Another thing, though, that I think is a little bit more subtle is there's lying and there's just laziness, right? And one of the things you want to do is make laziness easy to spot. So something that we do, for instance, people sometimes, every time I have a new junior web developer in the lab, they're like, obviously you don't have any 0-year-old subjects. Can we remove this from the list? I'm like, no, because basically if you're lazy, the easiest age to click is 0, 1, 2, or 3. And I know nobody that age is doing these studies. And you can also see it just from the histogram. So we'll have this like nice, normal, not quite normally distributed histogram of ages and a little bump at 1 and 0 years old. Which is part of how I know where the cutoff of real data is where does that bump show up? Now, you want to do this in a way that's not annoying to subjects, right? For them to if it's really hard for them to scroll down and pick their actual age, they will also be lazy, not giving you their actual age. But they can actually just type in an age here. But the thing is, once they're typing, instead of scrolling, it's no harder to type your real age than some fake age generally. So we'll just type it in. But then we're using validation to make sure they're actually giving an actual age, not typing ABC or something like that. Similarly for languages, if you put English as your first language on the list, you'll get a lot of English speakers. If you put Abenaki as your first language, which is alphabetically, You'll get, like, again, not many Abenaki speakers, but you get some. And probably they're not actually speakers of that language. Those are probably, again, your lazy subjects, which is helpful. Helpful when they tell you. All right, so how do you ensure your subjects are paying attention is another thing. So people are worried about, somebody, doing their experiment, I don't know, on the subway while talking to a friend. Again, so it turns out just as an empirical fact, they are paying attention-ish. And what I mean by ish here is they're paying attention about as much as your subjects in the laboratory are paying attention, which turns out also not to be necessarily all the time or all of them. But there's also some other things that you can do. You can put in manipulation checks, which this is back to my, I guess maybe I didn't say it this way earlier, but generally getting good quality data online is really just about, using good scientific hygiene. Stuff that you probably should have been doing in the lab anyway, and maybe already were, right? So manipulation checks, you want to make sure people understood the instructions, make sure that you have, questions embedded that will allow you to tell, did they actually understand the instructions? So, so you can look up manipulation checks, right? For nice examples, catch trials, just like really, really easy questions that anyone who's paying attention ought to get right. Something that's a little bit similar, but for whatever reason, this is the term that a number of people in the crowdsourcing literature like instructional manipulation checks. And these are often questions that are sort of like, honestly, often funny, right? So it'll be like, have you ever, while having breakfast in the morning before going to work, had a heart attack and died, right? And the people who click yes to that just aren't reading the instructions. Other thing you can do is just ask them. And again, it turns out people are remarkably willing, as long as they know you're not going to refuse to pay them, they're willing to say, yeah, actually, I was goofing off. Another thing you can do, if you can, depending on like the structure of your experiment, is make laziness annoying, right? So do you have the kind of experiment where you can give people immediate feedback on their responses, like they got it correct or incorrect? Have incorrect come with a 5-second long, like, bzzz, feedback noise. Whereas if they get it correct, it's just like ching and goes right on, right? The lazy people who want to get done, or the people who want to get done soon, will discover they will get done sooner by giving more right answers. So that's another way of just like, setting the incentives correctly. But nothing really beats just making your task more interesting or meaningful, right? So if you have a really, deathly dull experiment, you will get, so the experiments that I've had the most difficulty with, both in the laboratory and online, are statistical word segmentation experiments. I mean, listening to those stimuli for like 20 minutes is awful. And we regularly online will have to throw out 40% of the subjects who clearly just turned off their sound. But we also throw out like 20% of the subjects in the laboratory who also clearly have turned off the sound or went to sleep or something while we weren't paying attention. So if you can have a more interesting task, you generally get better data. But this is one that I think is actually more important in many ways, and people pay a bit less attention to, which is, how do I ensure subjects understood the instructions? So here is something I think that people often say, are worried, well, if the subjects aren't in the lab, how do I like supervise them, make sure they're paying attention? And I don't know what your labs are like. Every lab I've been into, the way we supervise people is put them in a room, make sure they're set to go, close the door and leave. So I have no idea what they're doing in the testing room. But what is different is that you or the experimenter are there to answer questions, right? If people are confused, which online you just aren't. The best thing you can do is avoid needing instructions, right? So this is part of what I talked about earlier about, using paradigms people are familiar with. That's part of why the exam is useful on the college campus, because people don't really need instructions about exams. Like, our, semi-pro test takers, also called undergraduates, sort of know what to do. Most of what we need them to do, we just don't have to explain. But again, that's not necessarily going to be the case, in the, on the web. But people don't like reading instructions. They don't read instructions when they need to. I mean, people buy stuff, expensive machinery, and then break it because they didn't read the instructions. They're not necessarily more likely to read your instructions in detail. If you can, just make it familiar so they don't have to, and keep the instructions as short as possible, that really is the gold standard. If you absolutely must try to convince people to do something that is not what they would just do anyway on their own accord, using a comprehension exam on the instructions is a tried and true method. So, just like a few questions, they get them wrong, they have to read the instructions again, and then you give them different questions, because obviously if you give them the same questions again, then people learn that that they can just do the quiz twice to get the answers. Piloting and feedback is also really critical. Again, even more so than, piloting and feedback is always critical, but really online, before you test, 1,000, pay 500 subjects in Amazon Mechanical Turk, it's a good idea to do a few rounds of testing where you're actually like paying people for feedback. Like, what did you think? Was this, how interesting was this? Did you understand what you were supposed to do? Did you have any concerns, et cetera, et cetera? And that can be incredibly useful. Yeah, Josh.
So somebody is asking about this avoiding needing instructions, and what about situations where experiments really do need very specific instructions or very specific kinds of participant experiment or interaction? So how do you deal with those kinds of experiments?
Yeah, I think that is where, so the comprehension exam, like, testing people if they understood the instructions, piloting to find out what people get confused about so you can pare down your instructions. Basically, every extra sentence of instructions you add decreases the number of people who read your instructions. So you really, want to try to get it down to the bare minimum of words that you need, which is where, again, piloting and getting feedback can be very helpful. Like, here's a simple kind of piloting that you could do by actually on Amazon Mechanical Turk potentially, but with like a Zoom call, right? Is have people read the instructions and then tell you back, what they actually thought they were supposed to do, and then you can ask them questions, for instance. Or do that. This is something that we'll use our undergraduates in the laboratory as pilot subjects for this sort of purpose. But I think that, but I would also sort of suggest to anyone who feels like they, have to have sort of like their task has to be not fun, or their task has to be complicated and confusing, to spend some time thinking about, potential alternatives. Because it's actually like so I'm not the best at this, but there are people out there who are amazing at turning the most boring, mundane, complicated things into something that is incredibly simple and fun, right? So I don't know. Actually, Josh, do you know the story behind reCAPTCHA?
Not well enough to tell it live right now.
All right. So everybody knows what a CAPTCHA is, right? This is where you like type in something that, or historically you typed in like some hard to read text to prove that you're a human. So Louis von Ahn, this like apparently must have been like, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of people out there who are like digitizing text that is too hard for machines to digitize to do character recognition on. Right? This is actually a problem that we have. It is really hard to get, hire people to, do to just like type up a whole lot of, books, like like the National Library of Congress or whatever. Like, that's a lot of work. Nobody wants to do it. It's really boring. It's hard to do it well without mistakes. And it turns out there's like millions of people doing the exact same thing, like almost every second around the world. So reCAPTCHA was born. And the original version always had two words. One was a word where they knew what the correct answer was, and one was a word they didn't know what the correct answer was. And so they used the word they knew the correct answer as the actual CAPTCHA to give you access to the website. And the fact that you got that one right made them guess that you probably got the other one right. But then they would also look at several other people's answers, make sure other people who had also gotten the control one correct also gave the same response. Now, of course, reCAPTCHA is doing things like digitizing text in street capture images and things like that. It was bought by Google, I believe, years ago. Yeah. Anyway, my point is that you can, with sufficient creativity, there's probably your research question probably can be done in a way that is more natural for subjects. That is a question of how much time you're willing to spend figuring out how to do that. I think that it is it's not necessarily optimal to just like wait forever for inspiration to strike, but it's probably optimal to spend some time on it. I know personally, and we'll have the last couple things are going to be the shortest of all. I'll preview a little bit of recruitment, but part of our method for recruitment when we're doing massive online studies that we need volunteers for is we'll keep iterating on an idea until it's something that we're like, oh yeah, I want to make that experiment because I want to do it myself, right? When you have that intuition, like that is something I would do, that sounds fun, then that's when you probably have a winner that people will want to do. And I think I think that's just like a good, I mean, as long as you are a reasonable proxy for a reasonable number of people, or like your lab mates are or whatnot, that's a good way of thinking about, is this task annoying? Are the instructions confusing? Keep on working on it till they're not.
We've also had a couple questions about like participant populations and recruitment. So is that something I should hold on to for a little bit? Are you going to get to that, or?
Yeah, let's wait for recruitment.
Okay. I'll follow up again when we get there.
Okay. And recruitment and manipulation checks are also just a good way of like if you write good manipulation checks, that's also a way of checking to make sure people understood the instructions. All right. Stuff you probably haven't thought about. So it turns out subjects online talk to each other. They probably do this in the laboratory too, right? I mean, if they're all undergraduates at the same institution, but we can actually study it online. So we know that there's networks of Amazon Mechanical Turkers who will talk to each other about the studies they're doing and make recommendations. They tend to be, at least from what I've seen, reasonably good about, not, if you ask them, don't tell other people about X, Y, and Z, they won't. And there's some self-policing in these communities, but it's something to be aware of. But also because it's the internet. So here is actually, I couldn't find, we hit the top, so one of my experiments hit the top page of Reddit some years ago. This is actually a time that it got some traction on Reddit more recently, same experiment though, I couldn't find the old one. Yeah, they were sharing their results with each other and people will do experiments, right? So like, I wonder what would happen if I answered this way and discuss that. Again, they tend to be pretty good at self-policing. So you'll see somebody's like, I'm doing the experiment a second time to see what happens. And you'll see other people saying, oh, make sure you check off the button, the check mark that says I've done this experiment already. We don't want to screw up the results of the experiment. So don't worry about it too much. But here's an example where it was a little bit more frustrating. So here's from the music lab, which my colleague Sam Mayer runs. And we've been collaborating on this project, testing musical IQ. And so then we saw this video on YouTube, which you notice has a whole lot of views. Anyway, this guy actually filmed himself going through the experiment trial by trial and discussing his responses to each trial. And he wasn't the only one who did that. So here's somebody else. Here's these people. These two are apparently really popular. Look at like their number of followers. So it's really good traffic. We could have a lot of people have done the experiment. Luckily, Sam had designed that one where there's a number of different stimulus sets. So the ones that are on the video are not necessarily the ones that an individual subject is going to see. And we obviously will be doing some analyses to see, are we getting statistically different results for stimulus sets that were discussed online or previewed online before and after the time the video went online. That's something to, so the good thing is obviously having 1 million people watch a video about your experiment is amazing recruitment, it's wonderful. It's something to think about though if you want to if you're worried about people being non-naive coming into the study. Now, of course, so you can think about that in design and also ask people, right? So if you're worried they may have already known about the study coming in, just add a question. having multiple stimulus sets is a good option. Another good option is to make the sort of like public facing part of your experiment not the thing you care the most about. So if you go back to the one that the Reddit page I was showing you, that experiment was sort of displayed as an experiment of like figuring out what your dialect was. It was actually a critical period experiment. Now, it turns out that making a dialect experiment was actually really good debriefing. People actually got really into discussing dialects and non-native dialects and so forth, and like really like delved into the research in ways that I've just never seen from a debriefing that I've done before. Usually people are like, give me my money, and I'm going. But it was helpful in that I think that we were not highlighting the part of the project that we cared most about. And so I was a little bit less worried about people talking about it. So also naivete to paradigm, even if people don't know the particular experiment, haven't heard about that. For instance, on Amazon Mechanical Turk, there are a lot of, especially dictator games. So a lot of your subjects are like essentially professional players of dictator games. I don't think we're at that point right now for language experiments in a way, like we don't have like professional, cultural evolution subjects, and I don't know how that would affect their data. But it turns out it actually does affect the econ games, something people have been finding. So again, that's something that I think it's a good idea to, if you can, just ask people, like, do you know what a dictator game is? So you at least can check and see if it matters, right? Are you getting different results? Yeah, Josh.
Sorry, it was an accident. I hit the video button.
Oh yeah. Well, not, no problem. And also remember again that your subjects may not be elite test takers. They may be unfamiliar, don't assume they're familiar with the paradigm that you're using. Their vocabulary may be smaller on average, not on average, or smaller on average than your like elite test takers that you're normally working with in the laboratory. Don't assume they know all the same, long words that you would expect an undergraduate in psychology to know. Also, level of education is going to be, again, sort of the point is that we're getting like a broader demographic, but that may mean that you have to think a little bit about how you're doing your communication. Similarly, you're not necessarily getting people who all have IQs over 130. And that is something that I've definitely noticed, like going from lab to online, often effect sizes are smaller, even when you're controlling for things like basically weeding out the people who aren't paying attention or whatnot, which may just be, just people having more difficulty with the task. Okay, so getting back to the take home, you may wonder, so I've just given a whole bunch of best practices, all of which may, some of which may sound scary, like people might not be paying attention or, understand the instructions or whatnot, maybe actually these are a whole bunch of chimpanzees. What I want to remind you is that, yes, all these things are issues, and you do have to, be careful about, good experimental hygiene, but that, your experiments online may be chimpanzees, the ones in the lab are a bunch of undergrads, and that may not be a whole lot better, right? So this is why it can both be true that there are these various issues with online studies, but that the data quality is as good as what you get in the laboratory, because honestly, a lot of the issues are exactly the same in the laboratory. And the other thing is, really consider your incentive structure. If you are giving people pay or credit, their incentive is to finish as quickly as possible. As opposed to, setting something up where their incentive is to give you the best data as possible. And that is just something that I think, like, there's no like cut and dry like thing to do here. It's just something to keep in mind when you are designing your studies. So recruitment, again, I mentioned, there's a bunch of different kinds of ways of getting your subjects online. I want to actually put in a plug for Qualtrics panels. So probably everybody's familiar with Qualtrics. Qualtrics also runs a paid survey service that really they use for running, like surveys, like market surveys and whatnot. But they subcontract with people around the world. So if you need, for instance, I did a study recently where I wanted non-native speakers of Spanish living in Spanish-speaking countries. They're like, yeah, we can totally do that. Which Spanish-speaking countries do you want? It's not necessarily cheap, right? So you can end up being like $10, $15, $20 a subject for, 20-minute experiment. But again, if you're looking for like a really specific population, that can end up being cheaper than spending a lot of effort trying to track these people down. That's again on the sort of like labor market paying people side. Limitations, though, of labor markets I really want to highlight are that they're just not that popular, right? So there's around 4 billion people with internet access and about 7,000 at any given time who will do experiments on Amazon Mechanical Turk. That's based on some like catch and release experiments. Versus millions of people playing games or taking quizzes on the internet right now. And when you think about it, it's probably not shocking. I mean, how much would someone have to pay you right now to drop whatever you're doing and like do their experiment? I don't know, I may just overvalue my time, but for me, the answer is a lot more than you have, right? I don't particularly want to do your experiment. If you're my friend, I might do it to be nice, but I would also be like, can you just find somebody else? I'm busy. And remember, this is despite the fact that I, and presumably you, care about research. You're actually motivated for research to happen. It's still not how you want to spend your time. The other thing is the demographics are pretty limited, especially on AMT. It's mostly adults, mostly American, a little bit better on prolific. Obviously, Qualtrics panels is the exception. Like, if you really need those targeted groups, that's sort of what I would go with, or what I have been going with. So volunteers, recruiting volunteers is more work, right? But you're also paying less for the subjects, and you're potentially getting more data than you would have otherwise gotten in your whole career. And so I think again, I'm not going to lie and say that it's easy, but I think that it is probably the optimal use of time. That's why my lab uses Amazon Mechanical Turk mostly for piloting. Or for very quick studies where for whatever reason we really only need 50 subjects and 20 stimuli or something. But our focus is mostly the large online experiments. If you're going the viral quiz way, they have to be short. 5 minutes is ideal. You can do a bit longer if people are motivated. So the music IQ test I mentioned earlier, taking people an average of 21 minutes, but we have 1.2 million subjects. That's because it's honestly a pretty fun study. And people are motivated to get to the end and find out what their music IQ is. Personalized feedback is also, I guess I've already mentioned this. So getting them and finding out what your music IQ is really popular-ish, right? So social comparison, this sort of like how good are you compared to other people, does work, but there's actually nice research showing it limits word of mouth. Basically, some people will find out, you take like a vocabulary test and they're like, I have, better vocabulary than 9 out of 10 people. They're like, awesome, share on Facebook. And then some people are like, I have, I'm in the 0th percentile, and they're maybe less likely to share on Facebook. Personalized feedback that's non-threatening seems to work better. I don't have data on this, but just if you look at the studies that have gone like really viral, like, they tend, with some exceptions, music IQ is one, to have more non-threatening feedback, like a dialect survey, right? These accent quizzes, right? Because I think in part, if you take a dialect quiz and it says like you have a Mississippi dialect, and you're like, I have never left the UK, you're like, stupid machine, doesn't know any better, and you don't necessarily feel like personally like your self-worth is threatened. Something else, so that I mentioned that big lexical decision task earlier. This one was really popular in part because at the end, it just gave people a list of words they didn't know. I forget if it even gave them the definitions or not, but people found that remarkably compelling. It's just an example of something that worked. Facilitating social media sharing, right? People will share on social media, but if you do make it a one-button click, this is something that we have implemented on Pushkin to just like make it easier for you to set up. That helps a lot. Instantly, if you look at Games with Words, that's my online website. If you go from 2012 to present, so about 1.6 million visitors. We don't really know exactly where they came from. It's called direct traffic on Google. It's people typing in the URL, or they have some sort of like tracking blocker. But then the biggest thing is social media, right? Which is twice as common as just links from a website. Social media is really, really powerful method of recruitment. if you actually look at the actual number one, domains that, research that subjects came from, 3 different versions of Facebook are the top 3. And then Reddit, and then one particular article on Slate. Thank you very much, Slate. Games, I think, are a great way of going, not just gamification. So really, this sort of like giving feedback is a kind of gamification. I believe there's going to, games I think are amazing for cognitive science. I think we've been underutilizing them and probably should utilize them more. I have certainly been underutilizing them. It's something that I'm very interested in watching how the other Josh's project goes, because I'm super interested in trying stuff like that too. And I already mentioned this one, like, are you excited yourself? If you aren't, then you may want to iterate a bit more. And this is, again, not how we usually design tasks in the laboratory. And again, I think that is because in the laboratory, like, the whole system is set up where we are getting people to do our studies by giving them something else they want, like money or course credit. And so we've not had to worry about, is this an interesting experiment to do? But I kind of wonder if we should, right? Because as I said, like, when you actually look at the data quality in the laboratory is not necessarily phenomenal, right? You have a decent number of people who are really just daydreaming and pressing keys. And probably because, like, we didn't give them anything particularly interesting to do. The other thing is, if you really want to see more research, especially on recruitment, Katarina Reinecke at the University of Washington has probably done the most work on this and has a bunch of really cool papers I'd check out. Okay, Josh, did I cover the recruitment questions, or should we bring them up now?
I think you got them. So the questions were mainly about, are the pools that you're recruiting from, are they sort of weird in some way? So are Mechanical Turk subjects professional exam takers, and are volunteer subjects who might do stuff on games with words, or the music lab, are they systematically different than the population as a whole?
So they are systematically different from the population as a whole in all cases, less so for the open, like, online laboratories like games with words. But actually, I think that once we get a large enough sample, I stop worrying as much about representativeness, because the truth is, in psychology, we rarely care about representative, or rather we care about the representative human, not representative living human, right? So because, like, the living humans are not a random distribution either. So, the Maori are way overrepresented, Native Americans are way underrepresented out of, like, the space of possible humans. But once you start having large samples, you can start actually measuring the variation and actually starting statistically modeling the variation. And I think that actually ends up getting closer to what we actually want, which is to understand what differences matter. And for that, what you need is a sufficiently large, sufficiently diverse population. Now, again, the massive online studies, you're not going to get hunter-gatherers. You're not going to get, if your study is only in English, you are not going to get a whole lot of people who don't know any English. You may get some. So sometimes people actually translate your experiment into another language, which is, something also it is useful to have a Google alert for your own website up, just to see what people are saying about your projects and seeing if you need to take that into account in analysis. And again, I would say, this may worry people who are used to doing things in the laboratory. Again, I would ask you that whether you know for sure that the same thing isn't happening in your own on-campus subject pool. I suspect that it probably is. What's nice about being online is that you can actually measure it and take it into account. Maybe it's happening more online. I don't know, right? Again, I think it's an empirical question we'd actually have to check. Amazon Mechanical Turk is far more weird in the sense of less representative. You will have a proportion of your subjects who are essentially professional subjects. That's true. There's a lot of people who aren't, who are one-off. Sometimes you'll get actually each other. I've definitely had faculty at other universities be subjects in my studies. I'm not entirely sure why they're doing that. Maybe this is common. I'm missing out because I've never done anybody else's study on AMT. Prolific is a little bit more diverse. But again, I would also, though, I would not want better to be the enemy of good. I wouldn't want perfect to be the enemy of better, right? So are AMT subjects any less representative or weirder than our typical undergraduates? No, they, across many, many metrics, they are less so, right? And AMT is probably, the quote unquote weirdest of the populations we've talked about. So I think that, we're moving the right direction when you move online. All right, privacy and security. So we've been getting some questions as we're going. So obviously cutting the question time a little bit, but data security, so this is the number one thing that I can't emphasize enough is, if at all possible, avoid sensitive data and identifying information, right? Remember, even the NSA gets hacked. I'll be talking about best practices to decrease the probability of being, even Google gets hacked. They used to have more than 1,000 security incidents a day, I heard yesterday. So there's no way you are going to be less hackable. So if you just don't have anything that is like bad to get released, then you're fine, right? The other thing, so if you don't need data, so for instance, for our Kid Talk project, the audio scrapbook, we do need kids' ages, and we wanted more fine grained than just year. And we realized something we could do is ask for month and year and not date, right? So it's a little bit harder to identify somebody based on just their month and year of birth. And we didn't need date, right? Like the actual day of the month. You can also, sometimes people will ask, I've known a lot of laboratories that ask quite a lot of detailed medical history information. If you're only using this to exclude people, do you really care which mental disorder they've been diagnosed with? Probably not. So I often have, if I have anything at all, a very simple, have you been diagnosed with any developmental impairments or something like that? I forget the wording that we've used. I mean, the wording obviously changes over time. Or if we don't need it, you just don't ask. IP address, I would not collect IP address. It's not actually that useful, and because the same computer can have many IP addresses if it's a laptop and moves around. The same IP address can be used by multiple people, right? So somebody does an experiment on their computer and they're like, hey, friend who's sitting down the hall, you want to do this too? It's fun. Here's my computer. So I actually don't think it's that useful anyway. You also want to watch out for the only female rabbi in Minneapolis problem. This is that there are some people that even if you're asking for just basic demographic things, if you just asked, city you live in, occupation, and gender, you may actually be able to uniquely identify somebody with just that information. So again, did you need to know their occupation with that level of detail? Just the less you have, if you don't need it, don't have it. And I think a useful rule of thumb is ask which is more likely. You're going to use this information or get hacked. If you're not going to use information, I just wouldn't collect it. And also use some basic protections. So use encryption like HTTPS, which is not hard. You can look up how to do that. Encrypt identifiers. So if you are getting any information you're using to identify somebody, run it through encryption, right? So if you have if you need a name or an email address for some reason, encrypt it immediately, right? So as part of the actual download process. When impossible, even better is hashing. So this is basically you have a mechanism for one-way encryption. So you can't actually decrypt. This is something we actually use on Kid Talk. So we use email addresses to identify people, but we obviously don't want to actually have anybody's email address because that's potentially identifying. I just don't want access to that data. So we don't keep the email address. The email address is immediately encrypted in one direction. So we can't ever get back from that encrypted value to the email address, but we're still able to tell if somebody is the same person, right? If that same person comes back and logs in again, we run it through the same encryption, and now we have our identifier. So, and by the way, remember Amazon Mechanical Turk worker IDs are uniquely identifying. So you really should be thinking about that as part of your identifiable data that you should be paying attention to. But I will say the biggest risk probably is you, not the internet. Like your laptop is hooked up to the internet too. I think people really would benefit from worrying less about whether their like web server or something is going to get hacked and whether their laptop has malware on it, right? If you're going to have unencrypted identifying data on your laptop as you're doing analyses, that is a security risk. And that's true whether you are doing studies online or in the laboratory. Use two-factor authentication as well for like downloading data or whatnot. It just makes it harder for people to crack your password. Even better is a USB security key. So these are actual physical sticks that you have to put into your computer in order to access something. This is something that we're implementing in Kid Talk, for instance. What I heard is that Google went from about around 1,000 security incidents a day to 0 when they implemented USB security keys on campus. And I also do auditing before. I mean, we're now in the, lots of people are posting their data online now. This is awesome. I would have somebody, read through the data and make sure there isn't stuff in there that you shouldn't be posting. This is a especially common issue if you have like an open comments box. So I will definitely get people in my online studies saying, hi, I'm, John Smith. Here's my email address. I'm interested in X, Y, and Z. Please email me. Right, and so you wouldn't want to necessarily like put that up on OSF. So actually, just like by default, never post comments on OSF because with hundreds of thousands of subjects, it can be hard to read through and just screen out the ones that have identifying information. And so if you have no way of, so if you have data that's just like not risky, like you have identifiers, but what you have is lexical decision times. So what? You get hacked, like it's not really going to hurt anybody. I would use some like standard precautions. If your data is completely anonymous, there's no way anyone, including you, could ever find out whose data it is. And it's just, lexical decisions. Again, I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you are interviewing, political dissidents in North Korea about their upcoming coup attempt, I would get a security consultant. Really, I mean, that's obviously like an extreme example, but if you have data that somebody might really want, then and the people who want it have the resources to get it from you, I would put a lot more effort into security. For the most part, honestly, our work is pretty much all completely anonymous, so I don't worry about it that much beyond some of these basic, encryptions and stuff. IRB. My biggest tip, if you're working with an IRB that's not familiar with online experiments, is talk to them in person about it. Actually, before you send in your application. Obviously, these days it's probably by phone. They, like us, are working in a cultural context in which they like have a bunch of rules of thumb about like what they know to ask about. So I definitely had an IRB at one point that got really concerned about making sure that they're like, you didn't include your oral consent procedure for kids. It is on the internet. There is no oral consent. I'm not talking to them. But they just like weren't thinking through it, right? Because they just say, have a checklist and they're going through and checking, making sure everything has been done. Whether they have an actual physical checklist or just like a mental checklist. I mean, that's just natural. And so actually talking through the issues is probably the single most useful thing. So I have been able to test kids without parental permission at 4 different universities now, by but everyone except for MIT required a conversation. So waiving documentation of consent. So some universities now just have this as a default checkbox. BC has now, like, are you requesting waiving documentation of consent because you're doing an online study? But not everybody is used to them yet. So useful things about talking about, since obviously you can't get people to like sign consent forms online, is use some standard IRB language to help them remember, why the rules they have are the rules they have, and talk about, like, for instance, barriers to participation, right? That's something actually the IRB is supposed to be safeguarding, is the ability of potential subjects to participate in and benefit from research. And by going online, you're actually lowering barriers to participation. We don't want documentation of consent, which is, documentation of consent is not the important thing. Consent is the important thing. We don't want the documents to get in the way. Also talking about community norms. So sometimes they'll want, like 3-page consent forms, which is actually can scare away certain populations. Like if you know your population, you should think about this. And talking about like, and actually it is scary, right? So if you're like used to just doing like, here's an online quiz. All right, I'm gonna do an online quiz, and suddenly you're given like this 3-page like legal looking document, it's actually kind of scary. That might not be what you want to use. And again, that's not about, like having people like, and so like if you're going to actually use like DocuSign or something like that, that would be terrifying for most people. Why am I doing DocuSign? Waiving parental consent. The main argument here has always been you can't prevent children from participating in the study. What you can do is decrease incentive to lie, right? So you can say, don't take the study if you're under 18, and you'll just have people lying about their age. You'll probably, like at best, you will have your most conscientious kids will just not take the study, right? So you don't really want to do that. And if you ask them, go get permission from your parent, they'll also just lie about that. There's something else you can talk about is implied consent. The kids have internet access, and they'll be engaging in your study and probably stuff similar to other things they might be doing online. So there's a certain amount of implied consent from their parents. And you can also use age to condition content. If you need to do that, I would definitely do it, right? If you're going to, if you're presenting potentially disturbing images, you might want to ask people's age up front and just like not show the kids those images. And also having your data be born anonymous, right? So just like you're not anonymizing the data, you just literally don't know who people are, is also something that makes IRBs more comfortable in collecting kid data, because it obviously decreases any potential risk. So on IRB or prolific, Qualtrics as well, it is a community standard to reject spammers, because it's a tragedy of the commons problem, right? If you start getting too many spammers in the system, it all falls apart. You want to be generous and not like, reject accidental spammers, make sure it's not because like your instructions were just bad, or the person was maybe did not have the necessary cultural intellectual competence to do the study. But they're just like literally spammers. In that case, you may want to reject them. That's something that you would need permission from IRB to do. And again, talking about community norms, being a good citizen of this platform is something you can talk about. So also something else IRBs sometimes are concerned about is showing subjects their own results, which, as I said, is something we use for recruitment. And there, I think, my argument is that, their data is their data. There's something incredibly paternalistic to be like, I want you to participate in the study, like show me something about your cognition, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it. Now, obviously, if we're talking about like, diagnosing people with, I don't know, something scary over the internet, in a like, online quiz, I wouldn't do that. But, telling people that, their percentile score in vocabulary as I think hopefully not so, like face threatening, that they can't handle it. And it's kind of weird for us to know and them not to know. So if you like add like the right contextualization, when you're giving people results and you're not giving them anything too scary, I think you probably should actually. Same with sharing results on social media. So sometimes, IRBs will want you to forbid people from doing that, which again, I think is just weird. Again, their data is their data. Like they should be allowed to say stuff online that they want to about their data. And when I say these are arguments, I mean, these are their reasons, right? I think these reasons are all, it's not about gaming the IRB. And I think there are, real, ethics questions about running studies online, but they're often not on the standard like IRB checklist that they're necessarily going to be thinking about. And I think to actually do good research online, these are things that you probably have to do. And my experience has, again, been that most IRBs, particularly if you can talk to them about it, will come around or make useful suggestions on how to, how to address exactly the concern. So by the way, I want to point, so I'm finishing, we're going to take a few more questions now, but I want to point out that we now have a new page for resources on the website, which I would check out. I also want to particularly point out this upcoming workshop at CogSci, which will obviously be online, which will be a one-day workshop that will be also really focused on design, some hands-on stuff, but a lot of it will be about design. This is actually a 3-day version of the same workshop with slightly different people from last December. A bunch of that is archived online, so you can find it and watch it now if you're interested. Also, Jennifer Rod gave a really fantastic talk at EPS last week. It's in part 1, actually the first talk in part 1 in this link. About especially sort of like labor market studies, tips and tricks I recommend. And I also recommend these readings, these papers on really thinking about how to design for the internet. All right, and that is it. So do we have any more questions?
Yeah, a few. So I'm going to work sort of backwards, starting with the IRB and data privacy stuff. So one question is kind of about the balancing act between wanting demographic information to be able to describe how weird or non-weird your sample is. So how do you think about the needs of sort of describing a sample versus just the data privacy part of it?
I think that so where I focus on, again, I think is what do I need to know? What are the, what's the concern, right? So I'm going to focus on particularly those demographic factors where I have like a reason to be concerned about it, or really feel like that would be helpful to know in analysis. The other thing that I will also point out, this is true in any study, but especially in sort of the viral quiz study, any study including online in the lab, you're limited in how many questions you can ask. And especially demographic questions when you ask online, they're sort of like the boring part of the experiment, and you get dropout if there are too many. So again, I'll ask the ones that I think I really need to know. And so some of that is actually just driven by there's some questions like I could ask, but then if I'm just not going to be able to do the study because people won't do it, it'll be too long. And I think that's for the viral quiz, definitely a trade-off. Something that we are trying to implement in Pushkin, it's semi-implemented right now, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to demo it on in 2 weeks, is having basically if you have a website like Games with Words, having a stable login so people can have an ID and come back. Which means that they do experiments over time. If you keep track of their demographic questions they've answered, you can avoid asking them the same question over again and actually just give them other questions. That's another way that we're looking at trying to basically be able to get more demographics out of people. There's a question of just how much people will come back. I don't know. But that's something that we'll find out. Certainly if you're doing some projects like Lumosity, it's sort of trivial for them. For other sorts of projects, this is exactly sort of data that I really wish places like Duolingo had, and they don't, because just nobody's interested in putting in demographic information so that they can learn a foreign language. So I think what exactly that you're trying to do is also going to affect what you can realistically ask.
Another kind of question has been about from a lot of our European colleagues about GDPR related things. I'm not sure if you're familiar. Yeah. So in general, data storing on a server and issues that come with that, but also specifically the right to be forgotten. So the right to remove data from the database.
So I am not a GDPR expert, but my understanding is there is a carve out for fully anonymous data. If you literally can't know that this is your data, then there is no right to have that deleted. There's only a right to have identifiable data deleted. And that's, I think, GDPR is another reason to do that. The other thing is, so I actually think so I need to understand GDPR better to understand exactly so I just haven't been collecting, identifiable information for the most part, so I've just not had to worry about it. I do think that GDPR does create a security risk, right? If you are basically adding more tracking of data in order to be able to delete data when people ask, that's basically giving people, hackers more opportunities to get a hold of the data. And I suspect there may be some carve-outs around that too, but I don't know. I would have to understand GDPR better. But I think, when in doubt, if you can keep your data unidentifiable, you should be fine.
And then we have a question about which is about the IRB. So if you're trying to describe the security of data collection for research involving children to your IRB, how have you done that? And how do you include things like protecting identity for participation and for handling audio or video data that's collected?
So Kid Talk, you may have noticed, was an audio scrapbook. There was a strategic reason there. I think we would actually be more successful in collecting data if a little bit faster if it was video, but choice of it being audio only was actually a privacy choice, right? That we thought that it would be. It is just less scary to have your audio data posted on ChildS than have your video data pointed on ChildS and posted on ChildS. We have so Kid Talk is the only for like the Kid Talk's the only time I've had to deal with audio stuff. We have basically privacy settings there, so you can say whether you want your data to be private to just the research team, if you allow transcripts to be put on a public repository, scientific repository, if you allow the audio to be on a public scientific repository, and if you allow your answers to survey questions to be on a public repository. So there are 4 checkboxes. We have them opt out rather than opt in. IRB, I think for whatever reason, I think didn't even ask about that, but it was in there. But I think they were comfortable with basically we're giving parents the option. We did build into the system, people can delete their data, although it is explained to everybody who is allowing for their data to go on repositories. Once it's on a repository, we're not going to try to remove it from the repository. I think they're like the horses out of the barn once it's on the internet, but we can certainly delete things from our own, that haven't gone on the repository yet from our own system. And that required, if I remember right, like 3 or 4 lengthy phone conversations with the IRB, mainly to get their head around what it is exactly we were trying to do. And I think talking to them a lot about community norms and standards was really useful, pointing out that this is something that parents are doing on Facebook all the time. We're not asking people to do anything that they don't normally do. What we're asking is for them to do it for science rather than so that people can sell them ads, right? And that seemed to be a pretty compelling argument to the IRB. And I think, and it's, compelling to me, right? So I mentioned the the viral quiz example of answer these questions, which Simpsons character are you? I don't use, that might work. I don't use that particular kind of, viral quiz clickbait because it would make me feel icky. I want to do stuff that I feel good about. And so, we do things like dialect quizzes, right? Because I actually do kind of feel good about that. Like people are learning something, it's actually kind of cool. If I had, some scientific reason to be trying to, if I had, I don't know, big 5 personality traits for all the Simpsons characters and you were doing a, personality test, then there I might do the which Simpsons character are you? But I think same thing for all this other stuff. I think also it helped with the IRB with Kid Talk that Yiting Huang, who's my collaborator on that, and I both use it with our own kids. So we're not asking anybody to do anything we're not doing ourselves.
I think we're getting close to the end here, so maybe I'll just verbally remind people. I know that it's been posted in the chat, but if you haven't been paying attention to the chat, there is a Q&A session on Thursday from 1 to 5. That's going to be hosted on our online experiments forum, which is a forum that's generally for any questions that have to do with conducting online research that aren't specific to a particular kind of technology. So if you've got questions about how to take your experiment and take your research and sort of morph it in the way that Josh has been describing throughout this session for online research, you could bring those specific questions to our Thursday forum. And any questions that we didn't get to answer live on the stream or haven't been answered in chat, you could also bring those to the Thursday discussion.
Yeah, I will also add, when I say it's not for answering technical questions, it's still for answering questions about technical questions. So I mean, if your question is like, I want to do X, what's the right like software platform I should look at, right? That is a perfectly legitimate question. We'll try to point you the right direction, but it's not a place to bring your coding questions. Like, I was trying to program this use this plugin in JS Psych. Go take that to the JS Psych forum.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you have JS Psych questions that are lingering from, say, last week, if you had some time to work on them, that forum is still running 24/7. So feel free to post here, and we'll try to keep an eye on that on Thursday as well, in case there are additional questions that are popping up there. All right, I think that's everything we've got. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks everyone.